I remember the day I first met Heather. It was a cool autumn afternoon, and we were both attending a charity event hosted by Doug. I had been invited due to my work in investments, but Heather immediately caught my eye. Her laughter filled the room, drawing me toward her like a magnet. We spent the whole evening talking, sharing stories, and connecting in ways I hadn't anticipated. From that moment, I knew there was something special between us, something worth holding on to. As time went by, Heather and I became inseparable. Our relationship flourished, and after 4 years together, I felt incredibly lucky. She wasn't just my partner, she was my confidant, my best friend. We had our ups and downs like any couple, but the good times always outweighed the bad. So when Doug invited us to his New Year's Eve party at his mansion, I was thrilled. It was the perfect chance to celebrate not only the holiday, but also the life we had built together. I rang the doorbell and stepped back, waiting for Doug to answer. While we waited, I pulled Heather in for a quick hug, kissing her softly. The love I felt for her was beyond words. These past 4 years had been the happiest of my life, and tonight we were going to celebrate in style, surrounded by friends. Just as I was about to ring the bell again, Doug opened the door with a grin and invited us in. The party was packed, even more than I expected from the number of cars outside. Doug hugged Heather tightly and kissed her cheek before turning to shake my hand. The night was filled with laughter, dancing, and more drinks than we probably should have had. We weren't worried, though. We were among the few invited to stay overnight, so there was no need to drive home. As the evening went on, I mingled with current and potential clients, keeping one eye on Heather. She was beautiful, and that always drew attention. I trusted her completely, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little jealous when I saw how many men gravitated toward her. Each time I stepped in to rescue her from unwanted attention, she'd smile, kiss me gently, and whisper a soft, "Thank you." But then I noticed one man in particular, Jonathan Douglas. He seemed to shadow Heather, never straying far from her side. At first, she ignored him, but as the night wore on, she stayed with him longer, laughing and lightly touching his arm. This wasn't like my Heather. Even Doug noticed, warning me that Jonathan was a notorious womanizer. When I finally stepped in to pull Heather away from Jonathan, her reaction stunned me. Instead of gratitude, she looked frustrated. "Stan, what's up with you tonight?" she asked, annoyed. I was enjoying my conversation with Jonathan. He's interesting and has hilarious stories. He might even offer me a job. My heart sank. "Honey, I don't trust that guy," I said firmly. "Doug says he's bad news, and I've heard things too. I just want you to stay safe." Heather smiled then, leaning in to kiss me. "You're cute when you're jealous," she teased. "But don't worry, you're all mine." The words lingered with me. She said I was hers, but she never said she was mine. In the months that followed, our marriage began to fall apart. Heather started coming home late, volunteering more time for the local Republican Party, where Jonathan was running for mayor. Our intimacy faded, replaced by distance and defensiveness. When I confided in Doug, his expression turned grim. Rumors were circulating about Jonathan's involvement with a married woman from Doug's New Year's party, and I feared that woman was my wife. Doug promised to find out the truth, and when the night of a high-profile political fundraiser arrived, I insisted Heather come with me, despite her hesitation. My worst fears were confirmed when we walked in and saw Jonathan at the front of the room. Heather's face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. I turned to her, my voice quiet and strained. "What's wrong?" Heather snapped out of it, forcing a weak smile. "Nothing, dear. I just didn't realize who this dinner was for." But the guilt was written all over her face, and I knew, in that moment, I was already losing her. Before putting on a smile and guiding Heather to a chair, he pulled it out for her and then sat Clarissa down next to him on his left. As I walked by, Doug called out to me. "Sorry, Stan. Didn't realize he was part of the group benefiting from our generosity when he invited you." I saw her reaction, buddy. I hope I'm wrong, but I've got a meeting with a friend on Monday I want you to join. How about lunch around 11:30? After finishing her meal, Heather excused herself to go to the restroom. I noticed that as she stood up, Jonathan also got up and left through a different door. I hesitated for a moment, thinking about following him, but Doug placed his hand on my shoulder and said, "No, Stan. It's already being handled, and if it's true, it's too late anyway. Just wait until Monday, please." Later that evening, I lost track of Heather again and went searching for her. When I came back from the bathroom, I snuck onto the stage and hid behind the curtain. I could hear soft moans and hushed voices, one of them unmistakably Heather's. I felt a surge of anger and moved toward the voices, but I tripped over a rope, causing some noise. I heard Heather whisper, "Oh no, someone's coming. I need to leave, honey. It won't help if we get caught. I'll see you at the office. I love you." I heard a quick kiss and hurried footsteps moving away. I followed, but was too late to see anything, just assuming it was Heather and Jonathan. As I walked back, I ran into Doug in the hallway. His face was dark with anger. He grabbed me and made me stop. "Damn it, Stan," he said. "I told you to leave it alone. We need to gather information before you do something rash. If she is cheating, and I think she is, we need proof. That way, you can get the best deal in a divorce if that's where this heads. The way you're acting, you're only going to get screwed over by the legal system." After calming me down a bit, Doug continued, "I saw them rushing down the other corridor. They stopped at a classroom door, and she looked around for you. When she didn't see you, she got scared and told him she thought you were trying to find them. Now, she's even more suspicious, and it'll be harder to get the truth. When we returned to the table, we played it cool. We made sure Heather and others saw us laughing and passing a pocket flask. As I sat next to her, Heather shot me a look and asked, 'Where were you?' Just then, Clarissa walked over to Doug, gave him a hug, and smiled at us. 'Okay, you two,' she said. 'Next time I catch you sneaking out to your car for a drink, I'll either come with you or call the cops. Now let me have a sip from that flask.' Heather seemed to relax a bit, turning to Clarissa and asking, 'Oh my God, what were they up to? I couldn't find them earlier.' Clarissa laughed and replied, 'Oh yeah, I tried to catch them for my share before they went inside, but as you can see, they beat me to it.' Later, during the dance, I took a turn with Clarissa. She was lost in the moment, and when I tried to glance around the room, she gently stopped me, refusing to follow my lead. She kissed me on the cheek and said, 'No, Stan, you don't want to. Look right now. Just dance with me and try to enjoy the evening. I know what you're going through, and it's only going to get worse. But remember, Doug and I are here for you. Always.' I relaxed a little and returned the kiss, whispering, 'Thanks for stepping in earlier. I nearly lost it, and Doug thinks that would have been a big mistake. I'm so angry at this guy. I don't know what to do.' The rest of the week and weekend were rough. I swung between fear and rage. Deep down, I knew Heather had emotionally left me, and it was only a matter of time before she physically left too. We hadn't been happy for weeks. I started to distance myself from her mentally, even though I wasn't certain if she had cheated. But if she hadn't, there was still something seriously wrong because we weren't the loving couple we used to be. Finally, the day of my meeting with Doug and his friend arrived. I had a strong feeling his friend would be a private investigator. I was nervous, my stomach in knots and dealing with heartburn. Beneath the surface, I could feel my anger simmering, and I knew Doug and his friend could see it. I was both dreading what I might learn and eager to know the truth. As I approached the table, Doug stood up, shook my hand, and pulled me into a hug. After the greeting, he introduced me to his friend, Simon Hobbs, who turned out to be an investigator. We took a minute to look over the menu and place our order with the waitress. Doug then said, "Let's get this unpleasant business out of the way." He looked at Simon, then back at me. Simon opened his briefcase, pulled out a large envelope, and handed it to me. "We've been following your wife and Mr. Douglas at Mr. Beaver's request. The surveillance lasted for 20 days, ending last Saturday night, he continued. During that time, we observed that they had lunch together daily, except for Sundays when she stayed home. They dined at various upscale hotels, and after each meal, they would retire to a room rented by Mr. Douglas's campaign. On 8 separate occasions, we were able to enter the room by posing as room service. Each time, neither was dressed and the bed was in use. Photos and reports are included. We also recorded audio by placing a microphone under the door. They had sex during every hotel visit. Simon paused, then added, "Additionally, we recorded multiple inappropriate encounters at the campaign office after hours. We have photographs of them engaging in sexual acts 3 times at the headquarters and once at a party with some of Mr. Douglas's supporters." He hesitated before saying, "Perhaps the worst thing we captured involved a meeting between Mr. Douglas, your wife, and Stephen Nagano, the president of the Municipal Employees Union, at a gentleman's club. Neo seemed quite taken with your wife, and we have photos of her sitting on his lap while his hand was under her dress." As I reviewed the report and evidence, I felt my anger boiling over. The depth of Heather's betrayal was staggering, and I knew there was no going back. I looked at Doug and said, "Well, start looking for that lawyer. Fights for the innocent in divorce cases. She despises public figures and businessmen who use their power to manipulate women. If we play this right, you won't just get rid of Heather and keep most of your assets, but we can also take Jonathan down." Doug gave me the name and contact information of the lawyer he recommended I called her later that day to set up a consultation when I told her. Assistant who I was, she said they'd been expecting my call and scheduled me for a 9 a.m. meeting the next morning. I agreed and received a list of documents and information to bring with me. When I arrived the next morning, I was immediately shown. To her office, I was impressed with my new lawyer, and we quickly got into a conversation about my goals for the divorce. I told her I want to dissolve this marriage and keep our property. Though I know that's unlikely, I also want to go after this wife-stealing prick for everything. I want to ruin his chances in the mayoral race and leave him broke. Sally, my lawyer, leaned back in her chair, rocking slightly as she thought. Then she smiled and asked, "Are you sure you want to go all out? Or do you want to financially destroy, ruin his reputation, and potentially send him to prison with the right moves? We can likely get him jailed. I've already reviewed parts of the investigator's report, and it's incredibly damaging. Sorry to say, but this case is so egregious that we could take down most of the key players involved. In fact, I'm legally obligated to hand over the report to the authorities because they violated several federal laws. If we go to the authorities first and then file for divorce, we'll shaft him harder. If you file first, he might find a way to escape or avoid punishment for a while." I replied, "I don't care what we do to him and the others who slept with Heather. As painful as this is, I know Heather is the one responsible for all of this, but she couldn't have done it without him. From the moment I saw him meet her, I knew he was the one pursuing her. He kept after her until she gave in and ended up in his bed. It takes 2 to tango. She always wore her wedding ring, so he knew she was married. I even heard them on tape talking about her stupid husband and planning how to treat me when the time came for the big breakup. Sally and I worked through her questions, and I made a firm decision. I told her to prepare and file the divorce papers immediately. We also agreed that the private investigator's report should be handed over to the FBI, right? A way to trigger an investigation into campaign law violations and the misuse of union and city funds. Sally suggested I contact the process server to serve Heather and threaten legal action against Jonathan Douglas. She warned, if he's like most politicians, he might threaten you with physical damage, try to get you fired, or even countersue if you persist. He may also attempt to negotiate secretly and offer you a bribe if that happens. And depending on the source of his funds, we could strike him with additional campaign law violations. Politicians often divert campaign money for personal use, and I wouldn't be surprised if Hettry's to do that. Sally then pulled out a tiny microphone and a recorder. I want you to keep these with you at all times, or the microphone hidden in your hair, and keep the voice recorder in your car. The transmitter has a range of about a kilometer, but even if you're out of range, the recorder will capture up to 6 hours of audio. It will automatically download the recordings. When you're back within range of your car, if you give me your car keys, I'll have someone install a dash cam while we finish here. She also advised, consider rehiring a private investigator, or let me hire one, to continue watching your wife and Mr. Douglas. I've heard rumors that your wife isn't the first woman he seduced, and he's used illegal means to cover things up in the past if we can catch him discussing plans or trying to manipulate the situation. We can really nail him and your wife. I smiled and said, the private investigator I hired gave me similar advice. I still have him on retainer the next Thursday. Sally called Mr. Malone. We're ready to file for divorce and serve your wife. Do you still want to follow the plan? Attend when she's served? Absolutely. At least I'll get some satisfaction out of it. I thought about it, and suggested, what if? We serve her tomorrow night at campaign headquarters. Wouldn't that be a good time? Sally was silent for a moment, and then said, no, Stan, that wouldn't be a good idea if you serve her there and make a scene. Everyone at the office will know immediately, and word will spread fast if that happens. Jonathan might lose the election, but he won't feel pressured to bribe or negotiate. With you. It's better to serve her when she's either alone or with him. Ideally, when they are alone. Okay, I get your point. How about we follow them tomorrow night? Heather usually doesn't get home until midnight on Fridays, and the investigators' reports said they often spend Friday nights alone in a hotel room. It's usually the same one they use during lunch. Couldn't we serve them room service and catch them in the ACT? Sally agreed to hire a process server to interrupt their Friday night hotel rendezvous. When I arrived at my office, 2-minute suits were waiting for me. They introduced themselves and asked to talk about how I was managing some funds for their widowed mother Ismailed, and invited them in. Once the door was closed, they showed me their FBI badges. They explained they were working on Jonathan's case based on the materials my lawyer had sent over. When they found out I planned to use a process server and record the interaction, they asked me to wear one of their devices to capture the conversation. This request made me uneasy, as I had been considering how I might make some side money off of Jonathan, my winnings, so to speak, but I couldn't come up with a good reason to refuse. So I agreed to wear their wire too that evening. We all followed the two lovebirds from campaign headquarters to the hotel. They left around 700 p.m. and were in the room by 7:30. There were so many of us it felt like a parade, and I worried we'd be spotted after they got to the hotel. We waited for almost an hour. I had the foresight to bring my camera to capture everything I'm not usually into home movies, but in this case, I made an exception. We were just about to knock on the door when a fortunate coincidence occurred. The elevator doors opened and a room service waiter came out pushing a cart full of dishes. He walked toward the room and gave us a questioning look. I smiled, pointed at the door, and said, "Go ahead. Be our guest. We didn't mean to interrupt Mr. Douglas's dinner. We'll just step aside for a moment." The waiter smiled and said, "No problem." He knocked on the door and when Jonath and asked who it was. The waiter replied, "Room service." The door opened, and the waiter entered the process server, and I stayed out of sight, waiting for the waiter to leave as he opened the door to exit. I moved forward to keep it from closing the process server, and I quietly slipped into the room, staying out of view. We waited until Jonathan and Heather started their dinner before fully entering. I was ahead of the process server when we walked in, and the sight before me was shocking and heartbreaking. Despite the detective's report, seeing it in person was far worse. Heather and Jonathan were completely undressed, sitting at a table with their meal laid out. They had ordered appetizers, dessert, and wine. Heather was sitting on Jonathan's lap, her back to him as they fed each other while having sex. They looked completely lost in their own world, kissing tenderly as they enjoyed each other's company. I began filming as we turned the corner. Finally, I gave the process server a nod, and He stepped forward. He asked, "Are you Jonathan Douglas and Heather Malone?" Heather screamed, jumped off Jonathan's lap, and ran to the bed, grabbing a hotel robe to cover herself. Jonathan cursed and stood up angrily. He growled, "Yeah, I'm Jonathan. Get the hell out of my room, or how did you even get in here?" The process server replied calmly, "The room service waiter let us in. Didn't you hear us ask if we could enter? I thought you invited us." He then walked further into the room and handed Heather the divorce paper, saying, "You've been served." I stepped forward and Heather finally noticed me. "Stan, damn you. What are you doing here? And what's all this talk about divorce? If you don't stop this nonsense, I'll ruin you. You'll have nothing, and I'll take everything." I looked at her calmly and said, "No, Heather, you won't. In fact, if you know what's good for you, you'll sign the papers and accept my terms when I'm done with you. I'll deal with your lover. I'm filing a lawsuit against him for mental cruelty and alienation of affection. Luckily, we live in a state where those lawsuits are still allowed. This could also hurt his election chances, to be blunt. You've been played, and now it's your turn to face the consequences." Heather didn't bother going home. That night, I didn't see or hear from her until the following Wednesday. When she called me at work, she didn't apologize or make small talk as soon as I answered. She said, "Jonathan and I want to meet with you to settle this mess. We've booked a conference. Room at the hotel for tonight, be there at 7. She didn't ask if I could come. She simply commanded it. I called Sally and told her about the call, then contacted my FBI contact. Sally insisted I go, and both she and the FBI would be there to support me. In case things went sideways, when I arrived at the hotel, I asked the receptionist where the meeting was and was led down a hallway to a small conference room. A large man stood guard at the door. As I tried to enter, he stopped me. "There's a private meeting going on, sir," he said. "I know," I replied. "I'm Stan Malone, and I'm supposed to be here after checking my ID." The guard knocked on the door. The door opened slightly, and he said, "Mr. Malone is here, sir." I couldn't hear the response, but the door closed. Again, the guard turned to me and said, "I need to search you, sir. Please empty your pockets into this tray." I emptied my pockets, and he patted me down. I was getting irritated and asked why I was being searched. The guard smirked and said, "Well, sir, political figures have been known to attract assassins, and Mr. Douglas doesn't want to take any risks. He suspected they were really searching for a wire or recording device, but didn't question it further. Fortunately, I had hidden the tiny transmitters in my long hair glued to my head. After the search, I waited another 5 minutes before they finally opened the door and allowed me into the conference room. When I walked into the room, I saw Heather sitting at the table looking directly at me. She looked guilty. Her face and chest flushed when she shifted in her seat. I realized she wasn't wearing any underwear. Then I glanced at Jonathan and I nearly lost control. His eyes were gleaming, and he had a smug grin on his face, clearly gloating about having just slept with my wife. The meeting went exactly as Sally and I had anticipated. Jonathan started by threatening to get me fired from my job, and then he escalated to threat of physical damage unless I gave Heather a better deal, and dropped my plans to sue him in his campaign. I leaned back in my chair and calmly said, Listen, I know you and your cronies might be able to damage or even eliminate me, but that won't save you. I've taken precautions if anything happens to me or my family. Even an accident, several packages will be sent out automatically. You know as well as I do that not all media can be controlled, and some will publish the information. Especially if I'm seriously hurt or eliminated, you'll be finished. I watched Jonathan's face fill with anger, and I saw that familiar tension in Heather's expression. That meant she was furious, smiling. I continued. I know exactly what you were doing before I walked in here, and I have photos of you doing it several times before. In fact, I have photos and recordings from your meeting last week with union leaders and senior city officials at the hotel. Do you really think they'll thank you for dragging them into this mess if anything happens to me? The paperwork being mailed out will expose them. Heather and you. Some of these people, let's just say, aren't ones you want. Cross Heather glared at me while Jonathan, looking a bit sick, tried to maintain his composure. He snapped, "You heard what I said. Stop your threats and end this quietly," or else his voice grew colder as he glared at me. Ow. Get out of my room. I smiled and leaned forward. You know, Jonathan, I might reconsider. Everything if I were confident in a fair divorce settlement for my wife, I said calmly. But if this town's idiots elect you, they'll get what they deserve. I stood up, maintaining eye contact with Jonathan until he looked uneasy. I could tell it took all his effort not to look away. I chuckled softly and turned toward the door before leaving. I glanced back and said, "Oh, by the way, Jonathan, things are going to get very uncomfortable for you soon." Without waiting for a response, I walked out. When I got home, I found my private investigator waiting in the driveway with the FBI agent. They were ready to debrief me after removing their microphones and packing up the equipment, the Ikiri. Investigator smiled and said, "We got it all after you left. Jonathan ordered his people to put you under surveillance and dig up anything they could use against you. You really rattled him." 3 days later, I followed up with Sally about the divorce. After some discussion, I brought up Jonathan. "Sally, I'm done waiting for this idiot." I told him and Heather what it would take for me to walk away, and they're still blocking me. Let's get aggressive, file the lawsuit against Jonathan. I think we should go for $10 million in damages. Sally paused to consider, then said, "Let's do it. That'll definitely get his attention and make headlines." As I left Sally's office and got into my car, I noticed one of Jonathan's thugs following me. He stepped back, grabbed his phone, and started gesturing wildly while talking. He must have overheard my conversation about the lawsuit. That evening, Jonathan called me, his voice filled with controlled fury. "Listen, idiot," he began, trying to sound calm. "Heather and I talked about the meeting, and we've decided to give you some of what you want. She'll sign the divorce papers without any changes, and she'll walk away with only her personal assets and quit her job. As for me, I'm willing to settle out of court. I'll make sure there's a voluntary settlement agreement. If you promise to keep quiet about all this, I couldn't help but laugh. Jonathan, I can promise you that I won't be the one to leak anything, but I can't control what others might do. There are probably hundreds of people who know by now that you're sleeping with my wife." There was a tense silence on the other end before Jonathan spoke again, frustrated. "Fine. I'll offer you $1.7 million. No questions asked if you sign a disclosure agreement. Heather will hand over the signed divorce papers with your proposed terms." I shook my head, amused. "Jonathan, I just told my lawyer to file a $10 million lawsuit. You'll have to offer a lot more than $1.7 million to make me." Jonathan cursed under his breath. "Okay, $2,300,000. That's my final offer. I'll cover it in the campaign books, but that's the best I can do." "Fine, Jonathan. But you better act fast. I won't stop my lawyer until I see the money in my account." I gave him a Cayman Islands account number. What I didn't tell him was that the account was set up in his name, using his address. I hoped the feds would find it and trace the money from his campaign. Once the funds arrived, I planned to move them immediately to keep them out of reach. That evening, my doorbell rang. The same guy who guarded the door during my meeting with Jonathan stood there with a clipboard. "Mr. Douglas asked me to bring this for your signature." I glanced at the one-page legal document and smirked. "Looks fine, but my lawyer needs to review it first." The man frowned. "I shouldn't leave without it." "Tough?" I shut the door and called Sally. An hour later, she arrived, reviewed the papers, and smiled. "It's good. Sign it." 3 days later, $2,300,000 landed in the Cayman account. That same day, my lawyer confirmed my uncontested divorce papers were filed and would be final in 30 days. I quickly transferred the money internationally, moving it through various banks. under a fictitious name in case Jonathan tried to claw it back. During this time, my work suffered. My commissions dropped, my focus slipped, and my colleagues had to cover for me. Even after the divorce was finalized, I kept making costly mistakes, and I couldn't stop worrying Jonathan or his people would retaliate. One night, my doorbell rang after 9 p.m. Heather stood there crying, a fresh bruise on her face. "Stan," she whispered, "can I talk to you?" I almost shut the door but hesitated. I led her to my office. Between sobs, she apologized. Jonathan knew how to manipulate me. He promised me a job after the election and I lost sight of us. I was furious with you on New Year's Eve when you tried to separate us. But you were right. Less than 3 hours after we met, he convinced me to sleep with him. She described how Jonathan kept stringing her along, promising to leave his wife after the election. That night, she caught him with a younger campaign volunteer. When she confronted him, he laughed. "What makes you think I'd marry an old strumpet? Like you?" he sneered. "If you behave, you can stay on as my social secretary and entertain my friends." When she slapped him, he punched her. "He's ruined everything," she said. "I know it's too late, but I wanted to apologize. If you can forgive me, I'd love to try again." She kissed my cheek and left. I watched her car speed off, wishing she'd realized all this before everything fell apart. In the days that followed, I couldn't bear to stay in the house. I listed it for sale and hired an agent to help me find a new place, somewhere free of the past. Occasionally, I called Doug or Sally for updates. The feds had taken over the investigation, suspecting corruption in the local police, and agreed to keep my name out of it unless absolutely necessary. 6 weeks later, the news broke. The feds had arrested everyone involved in Jonathan's scheme. Corruption, campaign violations, racketeering. Jonathan was charged with misusing funds and selling promises of future appointments. Heather was arrested too for her role. When I called Sally, she confirmed the leaks hadn't come from me. Everything was falling into place. The money Jonathan paid me was safe, and I couldn't help but smile, remembering the incriminating documents I'd carefully planted while looking for Heather. Finally, I was free. Free from Jonathan, from my unfaithful wife, and with $2,300,000 to start over. It was time to begin a new life, find someone truly worthy, and maybe even start a family.